I can tell you right now, this will not be a dull video. Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. A while ago we built this saw vise and it's time to actually put it to use and sharpen up some saws. I've been holding off on sharpening my saws for a while to put this to use and they have gotten extremely dull. So it's time to put them to work. I want to take this through kind of step by step. I'm going to do two different videos. One of them is going to be on the Ripsaw. What do you need for actual basic saw sharpening and how does that translate to a Ripsaw, which is really the easiest saw to sharpen. And then in the second video, I'm going to go into the crosscut saw. It's basically the same thing, but with slight modifications and differences. So in this video, we're going to be talking more about the basics of saw sharpening. What do you need to go into it? What are the tools? How does it work? And then I'll demonstrate on the first saw. And then in the next video, we're going to come back and talk to a little bit more of the difficult parts, the things that kind of confuse people, and go into the crosscut saw. So this should be kind of a fun series. And if you have any questions, as normal, leave them in the comments below. I'll try and get to them. Otherwise, you can email me anytime you'd like, and I can answer them there. So let's dive in. Now, first things first, I want to talk about the types of saws and particularly the plates. Now, a traditional hand saw is going to actually be something that is a little bit of a softer steel. It's not quite as hard as your plain iron, and it is much softer than the files that we'll be using to actually sharpen it. So a simple file can reduce the metal off of this very nicely. The one thing you want to be careful of is nowadays, if you buy a saw from the store, the teeth are actually going to be hardened. So the very tips of these will be much harder than the file, or just as hard as the file. And in doing so, you can actually ruin your files by trying to sharpen hardened teeth. The way you can tell the difference is the natural ones just tend to be the same color steel all the way down to the tooth. Whereas these ones from the store, you'll notice that the tips of them almost look blue and they have a discoloring on the tip. That means that they have been flame hardened. And the tips of these are much harder grade steel than back on the plate. Now, I have seen some people who have ground off that hardening and then cut in new teeth, and you can use that and resharpen that plate. But most of the time, these saws just aren't worth resharpening. They're a disposable saw. And that's what makes the older saws great, is that you can resharpen them over and over and over again. Next, I want to talk about the files, and you might think that this is a triangular file. It's actually not. It's actually six-sided. The tips actually have another flat side on them. And the reason they have a flat side on there is when you cut down into that groove, you don't want a sharp point in the steel. That sharp point is a place that the steel can then tear. Whereas having that flat spot on there means that it's going to be a stronger tooth. There's less chance that the tooth is going to want to break off. Now, the set of files I have is this one. It comes from Lee Valley. It's a really nice kit. It gives you a good selection of files. The handles don't come with it. I have those on my own, and getting a handle is always a good idea. You can usually pick them up at flea markets and things like that. I also have this angle gauge that goes onto the tip of the file, and that allows you to know what angle you are with the saw. I'll be covering that more, but this is a great tool. There's other ones that also go onto the handle, but sometimes they're not as easy because all of the tangs are different sizes, so you might have a handle that doesn't fit some of the tangs. So that's why I like this one that goes on the tip. It also gives you a second handle because a file is a two-handed tool. It's not a one-handed tool. It's always intended to hold both ends as you work it. Now, you'll notice that all of these have different markings on them. Like this is a 7 regular, a 7 slim, a 6 slim, a 6 extra slim, a 6 2X slim, and so on down. And a lot of people really get bent out of shape about the names of the files and making sure you're using this name file on this particular saw tooth. And I really want to tell people, don't worry about them. The names of the files mean absolutely nothing. They just go from big to little. As long as you have an assortment of them from big to little, you'll find that you have a file that works for every saw. As to the quality of the files, these ones that Lee Valley sells are from Bunco. They're from Portugal. I really like them. They're a good file. They'll last a long time. They're really nice and hard. As long as you take care of them, they will sharpen many saws. In the past, I've used the cheap ones that you can get from the hardware store or the big box store. They work fine. They will do the exact same thing. They just won't last as long. So you can buy a cheap file and go to town at it and learn to sharpen, but you're going to have to replace the file more often. Eventually, you're going to want to get yourself a nice kit that holds them all together. And I really like this because it keeps them all safe and clean, and I can roll them up, and I have a kit ready to go. Okay, so now let's talk about vices, as I have many of them. Having a good saw vise is a valuable thing, because what you want to be able to do is hold the plate very tightly up close to the top, and this will stop the plate from wanting to vibrate, wanting to slap back and forth as the file runs into it. You can usually pick up these antique ones at flea markets and the such for a decent price, usually like 25 to 30 bucks, but most of the time they're only like 8 inches to a foot long, and anytime you're doing a large thing like this, you're going to have to constantly be moving this vise along the saw. What I've done for years is I just got two random sticks, and I'll put the saw plate between them, and then I will clamp that into my bench vise. And this actually works really well. I can just put that in there and clamp it down, and now I can do the saw working. The problem is I'm way down here and I'm bent over it. I want to have it up here where I'm looking at it. And number two, it's a pain to put them together. It takes a minute or so per saw. It's cheap, it works well, but it's not the best. And so that's why I recently made this beast, which I love. I got a chance to use it a couple times already, and I'm looking forward to showing this, because now I can take the saw, I can put it in here, and we can very quickly set up the saw and go to town. And now the saw is up at my height. I can get very close to the teeth. I can work along it, and it's a really nice stiff frame so that there's not going to be any vibration in it. So getting a big, massive saw vise is nice. Is it necessary? No. There are lots cheaper ways you can do it and simpler ways, but this is nice. If you're going to be doing a lot of saw sharpening, making your own saw vise is a good use of your time. Another thing that I've recently started doing is putting masking tape on the saw vise. It protects the plate when you squeeze it between. It also protects the saw vise from the steel chips that are falling out. Is it necessary? No, but the more I use it, the more I think I like it. Who knows, in the future I might just skip that step, but a lot of people like to do that, and now I'm one of those. So let's talk about tooth geometry for a moment. There's a difference between PPI and TPI. So you have teeth per inch and points per inch. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 full teeth in 1 inch. So it's 4 tooth per inch, but it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points per inch. So this is a 5 PPI saw. So now let's talk about file size. Now that I know this is a 5 PPI saw, I could go to a chart and find out, ooh, I need this file. Or I can take the file and I can just set it in the gullet. Now if you notice here, the tooth actually sticks up a little bit past halfway on this file. That's not a good thing, because what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to be wearing out the middle of this file much faster than I'm going to be wearing out the sides of it. So I need a bigger file. So then I stick this one in there, and if I notice this one, the tooth only comes up about halfway into the file. It's actually ever so slightly less than halfway. So I know that this is the correct file for this tooth geometry, because I'm not going to be wearing out the middle of my file faster than I'm wearing out the ends of it. So next time you're tempted to go get a sizing chart, don't waste your time. Just grab a file, set it in there, and see how it fits. You just don't want to wear out the middle of the file faster than you wear out the sides, and then you will have a good file for the saw. Now, unfortunately, I'm a pilot, and so when I think about the angle of the file, I think about roll, pitch, and yaw. But this is actually a little bit different. But when it comes to filing a saw, you have different names. Number one, you have the slope, and that's the angle this way on it. So if I want to make it match the angle on this, this is cut at 45 degrees. I can bring it down here, and I have a 45-degree slope. Now, no one ever is going to cut a saw with a 45-degree slope, well, unless they really want to. But slope is one that is not used very often. Some people swear by putting slope into it, and some people say that's absolutely the worst thing you can do. Don't mess with it. So experiment. See if you like adding some slope. If you do, great. If you don't, then fine. Usually slope is only going to matter on your cross-cut saws or any saw where you put in fleam. Now fleam is when I rotate the blade this way. And what that's actually going to do is create a knife blade on the top. If you don't know the difference between a ripsaw and a crosscut saw, I have a video on that describes the main difference. But basically, the main difference is, do you add any fleam? So if I rotate this at an angle like that, and I'm always filing at that angle, then I'm adding a fleam into the saw, and that usually makes it a crosscut saw. where with most rip saws, especially the larger rip saws, we don't have any fleam in it. So I'm just going to be going straight across. So the file will be at 90 degrees to the plate. And then the last one is the rake. And the rake is actually the rotation of the file. And you can see on this one, I have a bit of a rake. This would be zero rake. The top of this is perfectly flat. And I'm just cutting a straight V down. And this one, if I match it to the tooth, it actually rakes forward a bit at an angle like this. For most rip saws, you're going to want a fairly aggressive rake. For most crosscut saws, you're going to want less aggressive or no rake at all, depending upon how hard or how fast you want to be cutting. More rake, you cut faster, but it's harder to push. It takes more force and there's a better chance of jamming. Less rake, it runs through smoother, less chance of tear out, but you're going to cut slower because it's less aggressive. If all of these numbers and names really get confusing, I'm going to leave a link down below to Kennebec Saws. He has a great guide that kind of puts all this together in one place. Otherwise, you can always Google them and you find different charts that will be talking about what is, rake, fleam, and slope. What are the different PPIs. Once you've done it a few times, all those things start to make sense and become a lot clearer. So just dive in and have a little bit of fun. Now for this saw, I'm going to have about a 10 degrees of rake, 0 fleam, and 0 slope. So I'm not going to be leaning it this way with the slope. I'm not going to be turning it this way. I just want to roll this forward in a rake pattern. And then I have this little guide set up on here that has a bit of rake. So when I put it in this is flat, and so I have a visual guide keeping this flat. If I ever notice that this starts tipping, that means that I'm rolling my saw too far one way or the other. I can keep it flat. The other thing to know is if the saw has been filed decently in the past, the last person has a pretty good idea of the way it should be filed, and so all you have to do is match the file to it, put that in there, and then adjust this guide until everything fits and matches and looks good. So now it's time to start sharpening, and the very first thing I want to do is I want to grab my mill file and I want to come through and I want to level out all the teeth. And basically what I want to do is cut a flat spot on the top of every tooth. What this allows me to do is see some of these teeth might be worn down, a little bit farther, and some of them might be up a little bit higher. I want all the teeth to have the exact same height all the way across. So I'm going to grab the file, hold it on here at 90 degrees, and just slide down the saw. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on there, I'm just trying to keep it even and flat. And you'll find a lot of jigs out there that you can hold onto this and we'll run down it. And so I'm going to look at these teeth. Usually takes about 2 passes in order for them. Yeah, you can see some of them have a really good flat spot and some of them don't have any flat spot at all. So I'm just going to do one more pass. Let's see how that looks. So here you can get a good idea of what that flat spot looks like on the tooth. Like this one has a very heavy flat spot. This one is a very light flat spot. And as I move this along, we should see a couple more. Yeah, like this one really doesn't have much of a flat spot. And so I want to keep going until I get rid of all of the sharp points and make sure that there's all a flat, shiny spot on the top of each one. So now these are all flat and shiny across the top. We are ready to actually start cutting the teeth. Now basically what I want to do is I want to cut those teeth so there's a flat spot on top, and I want to file down both sides until they just hit that flat spot. And so I have a really sharp corner at the top of each one, and all of them are the exact same height because that flat spot has been disappearing on all of them. The other thing to think about is some people are going to swear by filing from the heel to the toe. And some people are saying, no, you have to file from the toe all the way back to the heel. And in all honesty, it really doesn't matter that much. When you get into crosscut saws, it matters a little bit more because what happens is as you're filing, you're pushing all of the steel and material over onto the far side. So you have a burr on the opposite side of where you're pushing. And that burr can cause the saw to cut a little bit faster on one side or the other. And so that matters. Some people get very picky about where they push the burr. Sometimes I will file every other tooth, so I push all the burrs that way, and then I'll flip the saw around, and then I'll file every other tooth in the opposite direction. So I'm pushing half the burrs one way and half the burrs the other way, so that both sides of the teeth are just as fast. But for a rip saw like this, I'm not even going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to file every tooth in the same direction. It just makes it a little bit faster, and then I'll come back later and clean up that side so that it doesn't have as much of a burr on there. So now the question is, what am I looking for? Now you see how this one, there's no flat spot on top, and I don't see any shiny on top of this one here. Whereas this one here, I have the flat spot in here. So I've sharpened up to this point, and you see how I have that flat spot there. I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to put this on here and try and do it without bumping the camera because it's so close. And I'm going to, basically, I'm not putting any weight down on this. I don't want to put any force into the plane. I just want to let it run its course. And I got a hair of a flat spot still left there. There, now that flat spot is gone. Now I can move on to the next tooth. And most of these, it's taking 2 strokes. This saw has been kept fairly clean. And you can see 2 strokes there. I still have a little bit of a flat spot there. There we go. So now I can move on to the next one. If your saws stay in good shape, it should only take 2, maybe 3 strokes per piece. Sometimes it might take more. So then we can just march all the way along this thing, and it is sharp and ready to go. Now the next thing we have to talk about is set. So each of these teeth are, every other tooth is leaning out farther one way and the other. And this makes the actual cutting edge of the saw slightly fatter than the plate, so that the plate isn't being bound on. Now, I don't always set the saws, because most of the time if you put set in there, it'll last through 4 or 5 sharpenings. And so most of the time I set it every 4 or 5 times, depending upon how it is. This one actually has a decent amount of set. So I'm going to be talking about how to actually set a saw when I get into the crosscut saw, because this one does need to be set. So we'll cover that then. So now let's give this a test, and to give you an idea, this is a piece of 3/4 inch hickory, so not an easy saw to cut, and especially to start with Ripsaw. So I'm just going to, oh, I love the feeling of a sharp saw. So I'm just going to see, does this want to veer one way or the other? And no, that one's actually pulling a very nice and straight line. So every now and then your filing work, you'll find that that won't be a quite straight line. You're having to force the saw to try to stay one way or the other, and it will want to kind of veer a little bit on you. What you can do is fix that by first figuring out which way is it veering. So if I'm veering this way, then that means that I need to take down this side of the plate a little bit. This side is sticking out farther than this side, that making it wanting to turn this way. So what I can do is grab a diamond plate or a stone or anything like that. This is just a medium coarse, and I'll just slide it along the plate 1 or 2 times. That's all it needs. Just one light pass, not putting a lot of pressure on it. And then I'm going to try it again. And usually with 1 or 2 passes, you'll straighten out a saw. Now that's saying that the saw is the problem and not the hand running it. A lot of times the problem with a saw staying straight is the hand running it. But sometimes it is the saw's fault. If the saw is always veering to the same side, you know you have a problem with the plate. And if you just take a stone, and I like to use these diamond plates, and just 1 or 2 passes down the side, you'll find that it starts to come back to where it needs to be. If it doesn't, then try it 1 or 2 more times. But usually with just a couple strokes, you can keep a saw really nice and straight and file it out. Basically all it does is it takes off the very tips, especially if you have any burrs from a freshly sharpened saw, it gets rid of those burrs. So that is basically all you need for a rip saw. Next time we're going to talk about a crosscut saw, and to go into a little bit more of the specifics and some of the other things that I may have skipped on this that make it a little bit more confusing, but some of those technical items that other people like to know. So I hope you liked this video. I would love to hear your questions, your ideas. What thoughts do you have? What would you like to see created in the next one? Is there anything particular I missed or something you'd like to correct me on? I'd love to hear it. So that's about it for today. And until next time, have a wonderful day.